This video is brought to you by MUBI, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/ModernGurlz. The rise of Asian representation in Hollywood. If you're an avid movie fan, then you might have noticed a certain trend that's been taking over Hollywood. Now, I'm not talking about live-action remakes or incredibly belated sequels, of which there are more than enough, but the rise of Asian-centered stories in the mainstream. Like many industries, film and television have a long history of excluding anyone who doesn't fit a very specific mold. This lack of representation didn't exist in a vacuum, with politics, culture, and social movements influencing the exclusionary direction Hollywood has gone in. Over the last 100 years, on-screen depictions of Asian characters have evolved from racist caricatures to positive role models, but the journey there wasn't easy, with hundreds of Asian actors being left by the wayside in favor of their white counterparts. In today's video, we're going to take a look at Asian representation in Hollywood, from the early stars of the silent film era through the decades of yellowface to the record-breaking stories that are now dominating the box office and award shows. Let's get into it. The American film industry began picking up steam in the early 1910s, drawing throngs of people to California in the hopes of making it big, marking the beginning of Hollywood as we know it. While several stars flourished during this early era, one of the first notable Asian actors to find nationwide success was Sessue Hayakawa. Born in Japan in 1886, he came from an upper-class family who wanted him to become a banker. They sent him to the States to achieve this goal, but after completing his studies at the University of Chicago, he instead joined a Japanese theater company. In 1914, he made his screen debut in The Wrath of the Gods, and his performance received widespread praise from critics. He followed this up with several other successful films, including The Typhoon, The Sacrifice, and The Cheat, the latter of which cast him opposite up-and-coming actress Fanny Ward. Now, this wasn't the first time that he'd had a white paramour on screen, but this romance was presented in a new way, with sexual charisma being a key part of his character. The Cheat was a massive success and catapulted Hayakawa not only to stardom, but made him a heartthrob, one of the first non-white actors to achieve that coveted status. He quickly became a mainstay of the silent film era, appearing in more than half a dozen every year, and at the height of his popularity, he was being paid $3,500 a week. Today's equivalent would be about $70,000. While there was a lot of discussion about his good looks, there was no denying his talent either, with the press even declaring him the greatest living Japanese actor, and he was often spoken about alongside the likes of other Hollywood icons like Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks. He wasn't as beloved in his home country, with many of his films being banned due to their perceived negative portrayals of Japanese people and culture. When Hayakawa wasn't cast opposite a white actress, he was usually paired up with his wife, Tsuru Aoki, with the two eventually starring in over 24 films together over the course of the 1910s and 1920s. While they often played Japanese characters, sometimes their visible otherness led to them being cast as other ethnicities, including Burmese, Mexican, Native American, Chinese, and Indian, because at the time, if you weren't white, it was basically all the same thing. While both were successful in landing lead roles, they were often typecast. Aoki's characters played into age-old stereotypes about Asian women, like the subservient wife or the tragic ingenue. In other words, a victim. Hayakawa, on the other hand, was usually the villain, playing the forbidden lover or the dangerous stranger. Hayakawa was so fed up with these career limitations that he eventually formed his own production company to give himself a chance at hero roles, but these projects weren't the success that he'd hoped for. As the years went by, he appeared in less and less films, something credited to the increasing anti-Japanese sentiment in America, which eventually culminated in the Immigration Act of 1924, which banned all Asian immigrants from entering the country, with Senator David Reed, who co-authored the act, saying it was intended to, quote, keep American stock up to the highest standard. Aoki retired soon afterward, but Hayakawa hung on for the next decade, appearing in a handful of British, French, American, and Japanese productions that received mixed reception. Following the arrival of sound in the late 1920s, he was further typecast, with his accent preventing him from getting any roles other than the wicked foreigner. Now, Aoki and Hayakawa were by no means the only Asian actors to catch Hollywood's eye, and as their popularity began to wane, another star was on the rise. Born in 1905, Wong Song grew up in Los Angeles and always knew that she wanted to be a movie star. To the chagrin of her Chinese parents, she adopted the more Americanized Anna May Wong as her stage name. She started off as an extra and worked her way up to leading lady. She swung between sly villains and self-sacrificing victims, but unlike Aoki, her characters were always framed in a hypersexual way, with Wong becoming one of the earliest on-screen vamps. Although born and raised in America, which should have been an advantage when sound was introduced, Wong was perceived as too foreign by the general public. Like Hayakawa, Wong left the United States for greater opportunities, finding success in both Germany and the UK, but she eventually returned to Hollywood after being promised better parts. One of her first movies back was Daughter of the Dragon in 1931, which coincidentally starred Hayakawa, but Wong's character was the same sexy dragon lady she'd played time and time again. She quickly realized that nothing in the industry had changed, and although she auditioned for complex Asian characters, she was routinely passed over, and would often lose out on Asian roles to white actresses, with one of the most famous examples being the 1937 film The Good Earth, which saw Louise Rayner win an Oscar for the Chinese character Olan, a part Anna May Wong had openly wanted. The 1930s saw an increase in discrimination in Hollywood across the board, something that could be attributed to the widespread adoption of the Motion Picture Production Code, also known as the Hays Code. Amongst its many ridiculous rules was no miscegenation. At the time, laws were in place that banned interracial marriage in the United States, but up until that point, the film industry had done a decent job of acknowledging that those relationships existed. But under the Hays Code, they were prohibited from giving love interests different racial backgrounds, and if they ignored that, they ran the risk of the film never making it past the censors. Predictably, instead of hiring more people of color, studios just started taping their white stars' eyes back and painting their skin. This practice, known as yellowface, had already been happening in Hollywood for some time, but the Hays Code effectively made it the industry standard.
He can change a face so that its own mother wouldn't know it. With the addition of a costume, the makeup man transforms Mr. Astor into a Chinese Mandarin.
Several white stars donned yellowface, including Myrna Loy, Katharine Hepburn, and Rex Harrison, and studios noticed that audiences were less likely to accept the makeup job if there were actual Asians on screen, making it difficult for Asian actors to even get background roles. In the rare instances when Asians were hired, it was only as supporting characters, playing generic parts like the helpful servant or the dastardly villain. And with the Hays Code requiring that good triumph over evil, more often than not, they were disposable tools that helped the white leads get their happily ever after. Some Asian actors found a unique solution to the problem, hiding their heritage entirely. One of the most notable examples was Merle Oberon, who spent her entire career pretending she was from Tasmania, so no one would discover she was actually South Asian. This ruse allowed her to be cast in roles that would have traditionally only been offered to white women, like Anne Boleyn in The Private Life of Henry VIII, or Kathy in Wuthering Heights. Now, as difficult as things were for Asian actors at the time, they just got worse following the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of all persons deemed a threat to national security. And over the course of World War II, nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans were removed from their homes and sent to internment camps. This fed into the perpetual foreigner stigma, highlighting how no matter how long someone had been living in America, they'd never be fully accepted by the white majority.
He's a foreigner, you know, and foreigners aren't allowed to join any of our military organizations.
That may be so, but I happen to be a citizen of this country. I was born here and have lived here all my life.
Hollywood had already been depicting Asian characters as threats, but now they had the full support of the US government. Wartime propaganda films leaned hard into dehumanizing Japanese characters, leaving the audience with no other option but to cheer for their suffering. Chinese-American actor Richard Liu and Korean-American actor Philip Ahn were two of the most notable Asian actors cast in these sorts of ruthless soldier roles, and they became such staples of the genre that they even received death threats from so-called American patriots who mistakenly believed that they were Japanese. Anti-Asian sentiment remained long after the end of World War II, but in the late 1950s, things started to shift. The post-war American middle class had more time and money for leisure than any previous generation, and international travel exploded, with Hong Kong, India, Thailand, Japan, and the Pacific Islands all becoming popular tourist destinations. These countries developed a glamorous, exotic connotation in the Western imagination, and so did their women. Although the Hays Code wouldn't be fully abolished until 1968, filmmakers of the post-war era started pushing against it, and movies about white men falling in love with beautiful foreign women became increasingly common.
3 caught in the shadow world of the Orient. The temptations, taboos, and intrigues of the Far East.
In many of these films, the Asian woman would be a sex worker, submissive, available, and her entire identity representing a male fantasy. Films like The Tea House of the August Moon, The World of Susie Wong, and Sayonara followed this template, with the latter seeing Japanese actress Miyoshi Umeki becoming the first Asian woman to win an Oscar in 1957. Interestingly, that same year, Sessue Hayakawa was also nominated for The Bridge on the River Kwai, his first American production in nearly 30 years. A rare exception to the Asian seductress formula was 1959's The Crimson Kimono, which saw James Shigeta enter a love triangle with a white woman, something that hadn't been seen on screen in decades.
And fires a turbulent love story between an American girl and a Japanese boy.
While far from perfect, these films were some of the first to address the racism and prejudice the Asian community had faced. But despite all the new talent that emerged, Yellowface was still going strong, with Christopher Lee, Marlon Brando, Ava Gardner, and Jennifer Jones all playing Asian characters. Although the most remembered example is probably Mickey Rooney's terrible performance in Breakfast at Tiffany's. At least 1962's My Geisha had the self-awareness to poke fun at the Western fetishization of Asian women and the practice of Yellowface itself. Hollywood's interest in Asian stories was perhaps best demonstrated by 1961's Flower Drum Song, the first motion picture with a majority Asian American cast. It assembled some of the most recognizable Asian actors of the era, but unfortunately, the film underperformed at the box office, making an all-Asian cast concept a tough sell to executives for years afterwards. This gradual shift in Asian representation reflected a broader change in American values, one that was equally visible in the civil rights movement and the legislation it produced, like the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which removed discriminatory immigration quotas, or Loving v. Virginia in 1967, which made interracial marriage legal nationwide. Although every minority group benefited from this activism, this progress was weaponized to turn them against each other. It was around this time that the model minority myth began to gain traction, positioning Asian Americans as the ideal minority because of their work ethic and quiet compliance in the face of hardship. It was widely understood that this narrative was a way to undermine Black civil rights activists, by telling them that racism wasn't the problem, it was just their attitude that was keeping them from living the American dream. Just as the country was beginning to reckon with its treatment of its non-white residents, a new conflict brought a fresh wave of anti-Asian sentiment, the Vietnam War. This escalated through the 1960s and 70s, producing a similar social and cultural backlash that World War II had seen decades earlier. Returning veterans brought home a complicated mix of trauma and resentment, while the general public conflated all Asians with the mysterious enemy overseas. This led to a surge in harassment and discrimination against the growing Asian population. As is often the case, dozens of films about the war were released, like Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket, but the Vietnamese characters were depicted only as casualties or threats, never as real people.
Me love you long time.
It was near the end of the war that Asian characters started to be featured in other types of stories, in large part because of the mainstream popularity of martial arts. This was perhaps best illustrated by the TV series Kung Fu, which ran from 1972 to 1975. The show followed a Shaolin monk traveling through the American West, but despite the character having that cultural background, the role went to white actor David Carradine. Martial artist Bruce Lee had actually conceived the show, and while he'd had a supporting part in the Green Hornet series, his racial background was considered too big a risk to play the lead in Kung Fu. Disappointed, Lee went back to Hong Kong and made several films that turned him into a global icon. He returned to Hollywood and was on the way to becoming a star, but in 1973, at the age of 32, he unexpectedly passed away. His few American films were released posthumously and were a massive success, paving the way for other contemporary action stars like Angela Mao and Sho Kosugi. Asian men could be seen on several popular TV shows from the time period, including Hawaii Five-0, Star Trek, Magnum P.I., and Barney Miller. and while they typically played side characters, it was a relief to see them not depicted as racist caricatures. In feature films, however, they weren't as lucky. The martial artist continued to make appearances, fighting and flipping his way across the screen. Then came the wise old sage, a calming presence whose only mission was to support a white protagonist's growth. But the least flattering of these new Asian stock characters was the FOB. A mockery of immigrants who were fresh off the boat, these characters spoke in broken English, had a complete disregard for American customs, and existed entirely as comic relief. On occasion, they could be smart, but this was always contradicted by their social ineptitude, and their inability to assimilate was a reflection of how most white Americans continued to see Asians as others. All three of these male archetypes had one thing in common. None of them were allowed to be romantic leads. This made it clear to the white audience that Asian men weren't a threat. By desexualizing Asian men and hypersexualizing Asian women, the racial hierarchy was able to stay intact. Although Hollywood was still slacking off when it came to authentic representations of the Asian experience, that certainly isn't to say that it was the only place making movies worth watching. And around the world, different creatives have been putting their cultural stories to film. But unfortunately, they can be pretty hard to find, which is why I love MUBI. MUBI is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With MUBI, each and every film is hand-selected by its team of curators. Discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. MUBI's Between Tides Asian Avant-Garde collection, which they're presenting in partnership with the M+ Museum and the Chanel Culture Fund, is a great jumping-off point for anyone looking to uncover Asian cinema around the globe, from places like the Philippines to India to Hong Kong. Whether you're in the mood for a visually spectacular drama like Cemetery of Splendor, or a heartfelt documentary centered around family and food like Oxhide, each film in the collection addresses a different topic that has impacted the Asian community, asking the viewer to reflect on an experience they might not have been familiar with. My favorite of the bunch is probably Vietnam, a heartbreakingly beautiful story about two coal miners who are lovers. You can try MUBI free for 30 days at mubi.com/ModernGurlz. That's mubi.com/ModernGurlz for a whole month of great cinema for free. Immigration had been steadily increasing since the late 1960s, and by the 1990s, a wave of second-generation Asian Americans were coming of age and entering the workforce. This led to an increase in Asian critics, scholars, activists, and filmmakers, all of whom spoke out against Hollywood's misrepresentation. The films that emerged as a result were wholly different from anything we'd seen before, with The Joy Luck Club, The Wedding Banquet, and Saving Face addressing the sorts of dilemmas that Asian Americans faced. These films weren't going out of their way to undo the past. They just treated Asians as normal people. Television was quietly doing the same thing, just in smaller doses. Rather than centering Asian identity and issues, these shows simply made a point of including a variety of Asian characters, like girl next door types, jocks, nerds, sex symbols, and airheads. None of these roles were particularly groundbreaking, and often the characters had very little attachment to their Asian heritage, but collectively they sent a message. But there wasn't one type of Asian. Up until this point, there hadn't been a lot of children's media that featured Asian characters, but in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was a noticeable uptick. Disney's Mulan was probably the catalyst for this shift, and actively fought against many of the stereotypes that Hollywood had pushed onto Asian women. There soon came a wave of animated shows like Sagwa the Chinese Siamese Cat, The Life and Times of Juniper Lee, American Dragon Jake Long, and Shaolin Showdown, which introduced a generation of kids to different aspects of Asian culture. With anime growing increasingly popular in the West thanks to Sailor Moon, Pokémon, and Naruto, Hollywood set out to create its own versions, producing American-made anime shows like Samurai Jack, Teen Titans, Jackie Chan Adventures, and Avatar: The Last Airbender. Comic books had been getting the live-action treatment for ages, and with the Spider-Man and Batman franchises getting new life breathed into them in the 2000s, Hollywood figured they could do the same with manga and anime. This resulted in the release of the poorly received Dragon Ball Evolution, Speed Racer, and The Last Airbender. While they didn't go as far as making the actors don yellowface, the films were criticized for whitewashing the series' Asian and indigenous characters, and to this day, they're still considered some of the worst films ever made. One of the most notable Hollywood productions about Asian culture at that point was 2005's Memoirs of a Geisha, which drew controversy upon its release. Members of the Asian community voiced their concerns about casting Chinese actresses in Japanese roles, pointing out how it implied that all Asians were the same. This casting decision was further complicated by the tense relationship between China and Japan, and the film was even banned in China. Japanese critics also pointed out the film's inaccuracies when it came to geisha, presenting them in a westernized way that hypersexualized them. However, the film was a box office success, hinting at the future possibility of an all-Asian cast leading a major blockbuster. But Hollywood still wasn't ready for that. Instead, the industry found a new way to replace Asian faces with white ones. The Korean, Japanese, Thai, and Indian film industries were all releasing smash hits, and Hollywood wanted a piece of the pie without actually supporting Asian talent. Horror films were particularly prone to this, with The Ring, Shutter, The Uninvited, Dark Water, and The Eye all receiving American remakes that stripped them of their cultural identity. Not to mention, were just less interesting. The rise of streaming completely changed the types of projects that Hollywood greenlit. Because these platforms needed a lot of content to fill their libraries and appeal to global audiences, that meant projects with non-white leads, in non-English languages, set in non-American contexts, were suddenly economically attractive rather than risky. This happened to coincide with a rise in liberalism, which created a lot of social pressure towards diversity. The Oscars So White campaign pointed out how most of the industry's acclaim went to white people, and the backlash to 2015's Aloha, which cast Emma Stone as a mixed-race Native Hawaiian and Chinese character, showed that audiences were now paying attention to racial injustice and pushing back. The result of this political correctness was a wave of content that would have been unimaginable 50 years earlier. In 2015, Fresh Off the Boat premiered, and other shows like Master of None, Kim's Convenience, Dr. Ken, and Andy Mack began airing around the same time. Each of these showcased Asian families from different walks of life, addressing issues that were unique to the community, but still relatable. But the project that really changed things was Crazy Rich Asians in 2018. Based on Kevin Kwan's novel and directed by John M. Chu, it was the first major Hollywood studio film with an all-Asian cast since The Joy Luck Club 25 years earlier. What made it so monumental wasn't its box office numbers, but what it stood for. A love story set in an unapologetically Asian world with unapologetically Asian characters, it depicted strength and abundance rather than struggle and sacrifice, something a lot of viewers hadn't seen at such a large scale before. Several Asian rom-coms followed in quick succession: To All the Boys I Loved Before, Always Be My Maybe, The Sun Is Also a Star, The Half of It, and Fire Island. In the TV space, we saw a new archetype emerge, the Asian himbo, which was featured in the likes of The Good Place, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Beef, and Never Have I Ever. These characters stood in stark contrast to the cringy FOBs of past eras, making up for what they lacked in book smarts with sex appeal. Other shows like Pen 15, Nora from Queens, The Summer I Turned Pretty, and Killing Eve similarly dismantled antiquated stereotypes about Asian women, allowing them to be more than demure sex kittens who spent all their time cooking and cleaning. While most projects featuring Asian characters were pretty accessible, veering into guilty pleasure territory, there was also a rise in prestige films. Bong Joon-ho's Parasite won Best Picture at the 2020 Oscars, the first non-English language film to do so, while American productions like Minari and The Farewell were also released to positive reception. It honestly seemed like we were on the verge of an Asian cinema renaissance, but then the pandemic arrived, which triggered a sharp rise in anti-Asian hate crimes across the US. This echoed what had happened after Pearl Harbor and during the Vietnam War. But instead of retreating from Asian stories or depicting them as the enemy, Hollywood welcomed them with open arms. In 2022, Everything Everywhere All at Once swept the Academy Awards. Michelle Yeoh became the first Asian woman to win Best Actress in Oscar history, and Ke Huy Quan won Best Supporting Actor. Both were veterans of the industry who had spent years being sidelined, and their wins weren't just a milestone for Asian representation, but a long overdue acknowledgement of the talent that Hollywood had been undervaluing for decades. In 100 years, we'd gone from a world where Anna May Wong was considered too foreign to play a Chinese character, to a world where K-pop Demon Hunters is a global phenomenon. But it's worth being honest about why all of this is happening. Hollywood is telling more Asian stories because Asia has become too profitable to ignore. With the growing interest in Asian culture, from anime to K-pop, it's no surprise that stories incorporating these motifs have become more and more prevalent. And thankfully, we've moved on from the days when Asian actors could only play one of 3 character types. Now they get to appear in playful musicals, heartfelt dramas, and absurdist comedies, sometimes as the villain, sometimes as the hero, and sometimes as a bit of both. But with all that said, the Asian faces we see most often in mainstream Hollywood productions still aren't representative of the entire community. East Asian actors dominate the field, with South, Southeast, Central Asian, and Pacific Islander representation remaining incredibly limited. And while there are millions of mixed-race Asians living in America, it's worth noting how often the ones that make it into the industry are light-skinned with Western features, highlighting an inherent bias that Hollywood still can't quite shake. Obviously, we've come a long way since the days of the Hays Code and Yellowface, but that doesn't mean that the battle is won. And I hope that someday the average cast list is as diverse as real life can be. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!